Pikachu is the undeniable mascot of the Pokemon series and has been since the very beginning, but what if Pikachu never existed in the first place? What in the franchise would change, which Pokemon wouldn't exist, and who would replace it? Well, let's find out. First of all, let's talk about the base games, as some would be far different or have simply not released without Pikachu. Pokemon Yellow, and by extension Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, would have never existed in the first place, or at least there's a chance they wouldn't. I do imagine they would have ended up releasing similar games to these without Pikachu, but it does make you wonder which Pokemon they would choose as a replacement for it. As the original games were Pokemon Red, Blue and Green, it wouldn't be any of the Pokemon with those colours, as they're not going to release two games under the same name. They could have still gone on to make Pokemon Yellow by using Psyduck or Meowth as the mascot, with Meowth being more likely out of the two, although I do doubt this as they're simply not as popular. The only other game that rolls off the tongue as nicely as Pokemon Yellow for me is Pokemon Pink, and I imagine something like Clefairy or Jigglypuff would have worked just as good. If this was the case, the Let's Go games would have still existed, just with a completely different Pokemon on the front. I do think Let's Go Eevee would have stayed the same if this was the case, as Eevee has always been such a popular Pokemon, and similar to Pokemon Pink, it just rolls off the tongue nicely. As for the other game, out of the few options we've spoken about so far, I think they're all equally likely to exist with how the anime played out. Clefairy might have ended up working better because of the anime, but I'll get on to how it would have affected that as a whole later. Of course, this means absolutely nothing if the original Pokemon Yellow replacement didn't exist to begin with. However, it is fun to speculate. Now we've discussed what games would have been altered, let's move on to what Pokemon would have been affected or just not exist to begin with. As Pikachu is in the middle of an evolution line, Pichu wouldn't have existed due to there being no Pokemon to have a baby form, and Raichu wouldn't have existed unless it was a standalone Pokemon. However, there is a chance Raichu could have been its own thing, as there was a planned evolution for Raichu called Gorochu, but it was later cut, and I imagine this was because of Pichu. We'd also unfortunately lose the best pancake boy of Alolan Raichu, as similar to Pichu, a Pokemon can't get a regional form if there's nothing to be a form of to begin with. That's already two Pokemon gone and a regional form, but before we talk about the rest of the Pokemon that would disappear, there's even more things that wouldn't be created if Pikachu never existed that you probably forgot about. We'd not only lose out on Gigantamax Pikachu, but the three exclusive Z moves this family shares, of course being Catastrophe Pika, 10 million volt Thunderbolt, and Stoke Spark Surfer. And now for the absolute bombshell of the other Pokemon we'd lose, and oh man is it a lot. In Pokédex order, the Marowline, plus Minun, Pachirisu, Emolga, Dedenne, Togedemaru, Mimikyu, Yamper and Boltund, Morpeko, and finally the Pawmi line would all no longer exist without Pikachu. Can we get a salute to our fallen comrades? Thank you. Most of these are obvious as they're Pikachu clones, but a few aren't, like the Marowline, Mimikyu, Yamper and Boltund, and these lot potentially would exist, but I still included them anyways. Before Marow's name was revealed, people used to call it Pikablu, and it seems to take a lot of inspiration from Pikachu's design as well. And who knows, maybe Marrow would have looked a hell of a lot different than it does now if Pikachu wasn't there to begin with. This goes the same for Mimikyu actually, just in a completely different way, as the cloth that hides its body is supposed to look like a Pikachu. I do feel like Mimikyu could have existed regardless of what Pokemon it was based off of, as it just wants to be popular, but it would look completely different of course. And as for mainly Yamper, but Boltund as well, it has a ton of similar characteristics that the Pikachu family also has, so I included it just to be safe. I believe that's pretty much all the Pokemon that wouldn't exist if Pikachu was never designed, but feel free to let me know if I missed anything, as well as any Pokemon you think wouldn't exist in the comment section. Another thing that would massively change if Pikachu was gone is the anime, and this could go one of two ways. The first way this would have changed the anime is by simply giving Ash a different starter that wasn't Bulbasaur, Charmander or Squirtle, and there's definitely a few options for this. And it's kind of similar to the situation of what games would or wouldn't exist, but as there's no box art, we could technically choose anything in the Kanto Dex and it would work a lot better here. Well, anything unevolved, because it's highly unlikely Professor Oak is going to give Ash a Dragonite as his first Pokemon, or is he? We also have a much clearer answer for this one too, as until a last minute replacement, Clefairy was originally going to be Ash's partner in the Pokemon anime. I'm not really sure why they chose Clefairy of all Pokemon, and to be honest, I don't really blame them for changing it, because how else would they have started the series series without the infamous Spearow scene. One thing that is for sure is that it seems they were insistent on having a Pokemon that didn't want to evolve, and also wanted whoever Ash used to evolve by an evolution stone, as both Pikachu and Clefairy share these traits. So there's two ways this could have gone. They could have stuck with Clefairy and completely changed how the initial episode would have been, likely making it way less impactful, or they could have ended up still replacing Clefairy last second with a Pokemon that could have used such a powerful move like Thunderbolt, or at least something similar. As for the other way the series could have kicked off, it could have ended up just being like any other Pokemon playthrough where Ash wakes up on time and chooses one of the original starters. If this was the case, not only would he have chosen Squirtle, but we might have even seen more of his original Pokemon evolve into that final stage, which would have changed the entire course of the series, as he'd be far stronger way earlier. Although I do think the first option is much more likely, as they'd already written out the entire beginning to Ash's story, they just coincidentally gave him a Pikachu instead of a Clefairy. So now we've highlighted what would change in the Pokemon franchise, let's talk about what potential Pokemon would replace it in the spotlight. Answering this question is really tough, because although it seems like an obvious answer, I don't think it's quite as simple as you think it is. For example, as popular as Charizard is, I don't think it would work nearly as well, because despite having the most notoriety outside of Pikachu, at least for people who don't play Pokemon, not everyone is grabbed by something like a strong fire dragon. It's also not anywhere near as vibrant as Pikachu, so despite being incredibly popular, I don't think it would work as a mascot. However, I also feel like it can't just be a tiny baby Pokemon that happens to be super cute, it definitely has to have a mix. I think the base forms for the starters would be a pretty good shout, with Bulbasaur likely taking the #1 spot out of the three, as I think it just looks the best in that regard. And after going through the rest of the Kanto Pokedex to look for other options, I think the only Pokemon that really work as well are Clefairy and Eevee. Maybe something like Growlithe, Vulpix or Sandshrew could work as well, but I'm kind of on the fence with these as they're nowhere near as popular. If I had to make a final decision as to which Pokemon would replace Pikachu, I'd probably go with Eevee honestly, and this is for a multitude of reasons. First of all, it's extremely cute and clearly resonates well with the developers, otherwise they wouldn't have kept making new evolutions past the first generation. Secondly, there's a pretty good reason so many of the main characters in the anime have received them in one way or another. It's just super versatile and can match pretty much anyone's personality because of it. This also goes back to the first point, because it of course has 8 evolutions with all varying types and colours, which would make it great to slap on advertisements. And ultimately, it's currently one of 4 Pokemon to have their name in the title of an official Pokemon game alongside Pikachu, Arceus and soon to be Zygarde. Technically it's Legend ZA, but who else are you going to associate the letter Z with in Pokemon? Zangoose? And finally, it's got similar love to what Pikachu has had over the years by getting its own exclusive Z move, Extreme Evo Boost, as well as its own Gigantamax form alongside Pikachu. And that's what would have happened if Pikachu had never existed to begin with.